Ladies and gentlemen, we have a great treat in store for us. We're not only going to honor Alice Rivlin, but we have a chance to hear from her. Now, first of all, I want you to know this is a little club operation here. You know, there are clubs all around, and people want to get into them, and how do you get in, and so on. Well, Alice and I are co-members of a little club called Former Directors of the Office of Management and Budget. It's very exclusive, and you can't get in unless you perform. But the point is, she's done a lot of other things. For example, I'll just give you some samples. She graduated from Bryn Mawr. She wrote a thesis at the end on European integration. And what'd she do next? She goes over to Europe and works on the Marshall Plan, one of the great post-World War II operations. So she's right away involved in public policy. She comes back, she gets a PhD from all places, Radcliffe, Harvard. You know Harvard, with its place in the East. Then she worked at the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, the old HEW. It's not there anymore, but she didn't destroy it, she helped it. And then she was the original starter, pioneer of the Congressional Budget Office. That's a big deal. And she did that job for 8 years. She got that operation going and operating, and she was known as a person who tried to get it right. I mean, she's a Democrat, but she tried to get it right. And she got, one of these genius awards from the MacArthur Foundation. Who gets a genius award? My God, what's going on here anyway? Then she's president of the American Economic Association. And she's director of the Office of Management and Budget, vice chair of the Federal Reserve. My gosh. Then, of course, she's a senior fellow at Brookings, where she is now. She has many honorary degrees, including even one from Harvard. She's written a lot of books, and one of them is Reviving the American Dream. It's like Make America Great Again, right? Anyway, it's a great privilege for us to have here Alice Rivlin to receive the SIEPR Prize, and she's going to give us a few of her words of wisdom. Alice, it's a great honor and privilege to have you here.
Thank you very much, George. That was a over-the-top introduction, but I loved it. I'm just delighted to receive this wonderful prize from SIEPR because SIEPR is my kind of organization. It's a collection of people who think that economic policy is important and care about getting it right. SIEPR scholars believe that solid economic analysis can help shape policies and will make life better for most people. And they keep on believing that, even when the politicians who could make policies happen are manifestly not listening. So these are my kind of folks. This is a frustrating and discouraging time for those of us who care about economic policy. Despite slow but impressive recovery from the Great Recession, political candidates of both parties are stressing how badly the economy is performing. You would think we had 10% unemployment rather than 5%. They're voicing anger that much of the public shares over lagging wages, extreme inequality, the downsides of globalization and technical change, and the sins of the public and private establishment. Now, much of this anger is justifiable, but anger is not a strategy. The campaigns are not producing serious economic policy debate. Questions like, what would you actually do? And how would it work? And what would it cost? Are mostly not being asked or answered. Moreover, Washington has been mired in partisan gridlock for so long that expectations of post-election action seem almost like fantasies. So what you're going to get tonight is a rant. The rant of a frustrated moderate who believes that Americans are missing a huge opportunity. Despite what the politicians say, and even some academics, America is not in decline and not facing imminent economic disaster. We actually have a great economic system with proven strengths and resilience, which should be performing at a higher level and should be delivering a better life for more people. And the hard question is how to make that happen, how to translate this anger into realistic policy solutions. So what makes me angry is not the state of the economy, but the fact that we aren't making an effort to do anything to make it better. I believe we have at our disposal a set of economic policies, and I'll tell you what they are, that could command broad public support, bipartisan support, could move us toward a higher level of sustainable prosperity in which all groups share. These policies would enable us to continue being the world's leading economic power. We are that now, but we could be doing better and we could be leading the world to shared prosperity. Now, I'm not actually talking about wild new policy ideas, although we ought to be open to those. I'm talking about tried and true policies for growing the economy faster, such as modernizing infrastructure, funding science and skill development, as well as tax and environmental reforms to control the growth of long-term debt. We've implemented these policies successfully in the past. People at SIEPR have worked on many of them, but we can't get any policies enacted now because our political policy-making process has stopped working. We aren't even trying to solve problems by hammering out the compromises necessary to write laws and get them passed by Congress and signed by the president. It's our political system that has broken down, not the economy, which is why I titled this talk, "It's Not the Economy, Stupid." It's the broken political system. The problem is not so much polarization of policy views. The problem is we have forgotten that our Constitution, which politicians and Supreme Court justices laud to the heavens, requires that politicians work together across party and ideological lines to get anything done at all. Recapturing the lost art of political compromise is essential to realizing our economic potential. So what I want to do tonight is touch briefly on the state of our economy, say a word about what we should aspire to, and then run quickly over my list of feasible economic policies that would move us toward those goals. But finally, I'll share a few tentative thoughts about what we need to do to fix the policy-making process. I don't know the answer, but I want to get this audience, this SIEPR audience, thinking about it, because unless we fix our broken political process, we won't have constructive action on economic policy, and we won't have any customers for SIEPR research. Now, that's a large order for a short talk, but how often does one get an audience like this one that actually cares about economic policy? The current state of the US economy at the macro level looks really quite strong, but public perception of the state is really quite negative. We recovered slowly from the deep recession that followed the unnecessary financial crash of 2008. We didn't have to have that one. But we recovered more fully than other countries. We have pretty strong labor markets, 5% unemployment, 14 million jobs created since the low point in February of 2010, housing prices rising again, in case you haven't noticed. Other developed countries, especially Europe, are not doing so well, and developing countries are struggling with low oil and commodity prices. Overextended China is experiencing slower growth and having terrible trouble reorienting its economy away from dependence on manufacturing exports. Since the financial crisis was mostly our fault, it doesn't seem fair that we should emerge from its disastrous aftermath as the strongest economy in the world, but we have. And I think we've been more successful than others for basically two reasons. First, we have a very resilient economy, more flexible, adaptable, and innovative than others. Our economic system has shown time after time that it can absorb shocks, stock market crashes, accounting scandals, 9/11, and even the collapse of an asset as critical as housing, which is most households' principal asset. And secondly, after the crash, albeit not before, after the crash, our policymakers did the right things and did them quickly. The stimulus should have been bigger and lasted longer, but it helped a lot. And so did the Federal Reserve's aggressive easing of monetary policy. Stabilizing the financial sector, otherwise known as bailing out the banks, was absolutely necessary, even if it wasn't done in the most politically sensitive way. Allowing a cascade of major financial institutions to fail would have made the recession even deeper and would have wrecked the lives of millions more ordinary people in the name of punishing the reckless behavior of financial executives. We should all be glad that our policymakers didn't take that risk. At the macroeconomic level, we certainly don't look like an economy in decline, and we don't have to be if we implement the right policies. At the same time, we should not be surprised that so many people are angry. The puzzling question, I think, is why the anger has erupted now, when many of the flashpoints have been there for a long time. It's kind of like the French Revolution. Those peasants had been oppressed for centuries. Why did it happen exactly when it did? The recovery has exacerbated inequality, with most of the income gains going to the very top, the top 1%, the top tenth of a percent. Average wages have not been rising for quite a long time. Manufacturing jobs are continuing a long decline. Workers with only a high school education or less are falling further and further behind. For many, the dream of getting a high-paying job and seeing one's children do even better has faded into disappointment. Big money dominates politics and the media. Those who profit from the status quo use their resources effectively to keep a good thing going, whether by capturing regulatory agencies or blocking threatened reform legislation. Perhaps more importantly, at an elite university like this one, a whole generation of young idealists sees opportunities to make the world a better place and observes those in power bickering with each other rather than acting. The grown-ups who were supposedly in charge messed up pretty badly. They allowed the risky, uncontrollable behavior, unconscionable behavior that both public and private, that caused the financial crash, and now they aren't even making a serious effort to make amends. So what should we aspire to? My shorthand for the right goal for the economy is sustainable, inclusive, rising prosperity. Sustainability is critical. We don't want to live in a temporarily prosperous society that's eating its seed corn, polluting the environment, and running up unpayable debts. We used to think of inflation as a major threat to sustainable rising prosperity, and we charged central bankers with combating it. But inflation has evaporated as a threat to sustainable growth in the United States and I think in other big developed countries. In fact, the Fed is worried that it's too low, and it seems unlikely to return to the list of threats in the foreseeable future. The most serious threat to future prosperity at this moment is climate change, followed by financial instability, not having another crash of 2008. On climate change, an intransigent minority is denying that there is such a problem, which is enough to prevent the majority from taking serious action, such as a carbon tax. On financial stability, we've taken serious actions to reduce the likelihood of another 2008, but we don't know how well they'll work or whether politicians faced with well-financed lobbying by financial institutions, will have the courage to enforce them when it matters. Prosperity is relative to time and place, but it's the trajectory that matters most. Doing better and having hope for the future and for the next generation. Inclusive prosperity means that major groups, racial, ethnic, income groups, with which people identify are sharing in the improving standard of living and expect their kids to do better than they are. A sense of fairness and hope are both necessary to a sustainably prosperous economy. So against my standard of sustainable, inclusive, rising prosperity, we're doing pretty well on prosperity, but badly on sustainability and not very well on inclusiveness. To do better, we need two types of policy changes. First, we need policies that enhance sustainable economic growth by increasing productivity of the workforce, especially important in an aging society, which needs its relatively smaller workforce to be as productive as it possibly can be. Now, some scholars argue that productivity growth will necessarily be anemic in the future. Robert Gordon has written a very impressive book, which I commend to you, except it's very long, about the golden age of invention and its impact on productivity. But he alleges that the golden age is over, and all that neat stuff that Silicon Valley is inventing won't have a comparable impact on productivity. I don't think we know that. Economists are lousy at predicting productivity growth. We've never done it well. In any case, we would be stupid not to enact policies that we're pretty sure will move productivity in the right direction, and we have some. And second, we need policies that share the growth more broadly and make the slices of the larger pie more equal. Many economists, including my late colleague Art Oken, used to think that there was a trade-off between these two kinds of policies, that faster growth meant more inequality and vice versa. But there's accumulating evidence that economic growth and broad distribution of the gains reinforce each other, and policies can be designed to foster both faster growth and less inequality. My list of potential consensus policies, which I'm about to give you, could all be crafted to enhance both goals at once. So here's my list. A big investment in modernizing public infrastructure. Not only fixing crumbling roads and bridges and keeping them in good shape, but building the infrastructure we need for smart, non-polluting cars, faster, more reliable rail and transit systems, safer, more efficient airports and air traffic control, faster, more reliable internet service, or whatever the next generation is going to be called. Modernizing infrastructure could raise productivity as well as creating the jobs that we need to restore even tighter labor markets and give more people chances to move up. Second, early childhood nurturing and high-quality preschool programs. There's strong evidence that the early years of life matter a lot to brain development and language skills, and young children can be permanently damaged by violence and fear and neglect. And this idea has bipartisan support. Oklahoma, which is a very red state, now has universal pre-K, and the very successful nurse visitor program that works with new moms has bipartisan support in Congress, although not enough money. Third, more funding for basic science and increased access to post-secondary education, especially technical education. We should shift the mix to more generous grant aid and less reliance on student loans, especially for low-income students. But free college is not a good idea. It would be a taxpayer-supported windfall for the more affluent families who would have paid for college anyway. Fourth, comprehensive immigration reform. In addition to reducing illegal immigration and enforcing the laws, we must get law-abiding, undocumented aliens out of the shadows and into more productive jobs. We need more young workers in our aging society, and immigrants tend to be young and hardworking. Despite the enormous tension that it's producing, I venture a prediction that the Syrian refugees may save Europeans from the stagnation of an aging workforce. And reform of the tax system to make it more pro-growth and more progressive. The income taxes, both corporate and individual, present a huge opportunity to do that, and there is bipartisan support for this. In general, conservatives argue that lower tax rates favor economic growth. We could have lower tax rates and more revenue if we were willing to cut back on the special provisions that narrow the tax base and mainly benefit high-income people. And there are lots of examples of that. And a carbon tax that started low and rose predictably over time so people could adapt would discourage fossil fuel use and raise revenue, some of which could compensate for lower income fuel use, could compensate lower income fuel users for the increased price. Simplifying regulations and getting rid of unnecessarily burdened ones. A constant applause line from conservative and libertarian politicians is the burden that environmental and safety and other regulations put on businesses, especially small businesses. Personally, I suspect that conservatives exaggerate the economic burden of regulation, but there's some fire under all that smoke, and many ways to accomplish the same goals more efficiently. Liberals and progressives would improve their credibility if they could embrace re-examination of federal regulations aimed at accomplishing goals in simpler and more effective ways. Restructuring and modernizing federal spending programs. The federal government has, and any OMB director knows this, has many domestic programs created years ago by well-intentioned legislators and signed by presidents of both parties, most of them grants to states and communities and nonprofit organizations. These programs live on for decades because they have few vocal supporters, and it's too much trouble to re-examine whether they're still needed. Even abolishing all these programs wouldn't save much money. The big bucks are in the few big programs like Medicare and Social Security. But weeding out antiquated and less effective programs or combining them into block grants for states would help reduce the widespread impression that the federal government does too much and meddles too much. But this kind of review never happens. Progressives don't do it because they fear it will be an excuse for cutting programs they value. And even the very right-wing small government conservatives don't do it because it's too much work and it doesn't save much money. Instead, they lower the caps on the whole category called non-defense discretionary spending. George knows what that means. But the annually appropriated programs, and let them all limp along on slightly reduced budgets year after year. And finally, we need to take steps now to reduce the growth of future debt and eventually reduce it. The debt to GDP ratio more than doubled from a comfortable 35% at the end of 2007 to about 76% now, mostly because of the Great Recession and measures taken to mitigate its effects. That's not a problem now because interest rates are low and deficits are at manageable levels. The big worry is for the longer run future as the baby boom generation ages into Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security. We need these programs. Cutting them is both undesirable and politically infeasible. Even Donald Trump recognizes that. And it's irresponsible to scare older people into thinking they might have to deal with cuts in benefits that they now rely on. But we can take steps now to reduce their growth in the 2020s and 2030s and beyond, and raise more tax revenue by reducing the benefits slowly far in the future and raising more tax revenue, or both. Again, it would take a bipartisan compromise to hammer out a plan for preserving these vital programs in the future and reducing the growth of debt, but we can't do that when Republicans and Democrats have stopped talking to each other. So that's my list of economic policy changes that would move us in the right direction. Others would have different lists or variations on mine. The point is that our political system is too broken to focus on its job of creating compromises and moving in the right direction. What we have instead is a policy-making apparatus reduced to finger-pointing, blaming the opposition, lurching from one crisis to another, and accomplishing almost nothing. We consider it a victory when we don't close the government and we don't default on the debt. Well, we're missing a huge opportunity to have a more prosperous and more equal economy. And the problem, I think, is really not so much polarization of political views. It's failure to communicate across that chasm. Now, there's no doubt about the polarization of politics and political leaders. There's plenty of solid political science research that shows that there are fewer centrists in the House and the Senate. There are fewer contested congressional districts. There are hardly any. And there's hardly any bipartisan votes anymore. You can't name a bridge without it becoming a partisan issue. And there's been a drop in bipartisan interaction, conversation, and socialization. Members of Congress don't move to Washington anymore. They're only there in the middle of the week. And that means they don't get to know each other very well, and their kids don't play on the same soccer team, and there just isn't much opportunity for on-the-sidelines conversation. There's more doubt, I think, about the polarization of the public's views on policy. Primary voters reflect extremes on some issues, but there are a rising number of independents. We've long been a pretty centrist country, averse to big changes in policy. Healthcare is a good example. The worst mistake that President Obama made was to say that if you like your health insurance plan, you can keep it, which was about 95% true, but 95% isn't enough if you're president of the United States. And people were very worried that the status quo was going to be disrupted. But there's no doubt about the gridlock in Washington and the rising incivility. The budget process has broken down completely. There's hardly any legislation of any sort over the last several years. We exist on making the absolute minimum changes and nothing else. The primary system gets most of the blame for polarization. Primary voters reflect the base and are more extreme than general election voters. Ironically, primaries were supposed to be a reform that would get the choice of candidates out of those smoke-filled rooms and into the hands of voters. But those guys with their cigars wanted to win, and so they tended to pick candidates they thought were electable and therefore more centrist. But whatever the causes of congressional polarization, it shouldn't inevitably lead to the breakdown of policymaking. That breakdown reflects the rejection of the art of compromise and the denigration of the search for common policy ground. Our founding fathers were intent on avoiding tyranny and protecting the rights of minorities. So they gave us a constitution that was not a winner-take-all parliamentary system. They didn't much like parties at all, but had this complicated separation of powers. But what's not always recognized, at least apparently, is that multiple levels of detailed negotiation are required between the House and the Senate, between the Congress and the executive. Sometimes the Supreme Court gets into the action, even when the same party dominates all branches. It was designed that way. Compromise is an even more obvious imperative if we have divided government, and divided government may well become the new normal. The electoral map is more favorable to Democrats in presidential years and more to Republicans in off years. Moreover, the two-party system fosters polarization in any constitutional structure. If we had multiple parties arrayed across the ideological spectrum, they'd have to form coalitions in order to govern, but that pattern fits better with a parliamentary system than it does with ours. The fact that political leaders are not working together to solve problems and not getting anything done bothers the public, as it should. President Barack Obama's rather naive hope that he could change the atmosphere in Washington and get the warring sides working together was part of his enormous appeal in 2008. But instead of taking the hint that constructive compromise would be popular, politicians have spent most of their energy blaming each other for obstructionism. The question of who's more to blame, Republicans or Democrats, gets a lot of attention. My two favorite analyses by colleagues in Washington have wonderful titles. Tom Mann and Norm Ornstein's book, It's Even Worse Than You Think, and E.J. Dionne's recent book, Why the Right Went Wrong, both trace the decline of compromise in Congress and blame it mainly on the Tea Party. I think that's right, but there's plenty of blame to go around. Democrats, too, have become more intransigent, more insistent on not touching entitlement programs, for example. But it doesn't matter. Who is to blame is not the right question. The right question is, what can we do about it? People who believe, as I do, that there are policies that could command broad support and move us in the right direction have got to figure out how to make that happen. Otherwise, we just sit around and talk to each other, which is rather fun, but doesn't get anything done. So what can we do? Well, we could change the Constitution. Our political system is acting as though we had a parliamentary system, and one party could win everything and then call all the shots, and we don't. I don't think that's a route worth going down. We aren't going to change the Constitution, and there are downsides to parliamentary systems. So I would cross that off my list. I'm not super hopeful about changing the rules about who can vote in primaries or how to draw election districts, but I think it certainly ought to be tried, and California is in the lead in trying, and I think we should all urge California on and other states to follow. I'm more hopeful that after the election, Congress and the president, with the right leadership in both places, can get back to working together across party lines and put in place some of the agenda that I've outlined. But it's going to take vocal public pressure to make that happen. My dream outcome of the election is, because I'm a Democrat and I like Hillary Clinton, that she wins, and that Paul Ryan, whom I also like very much and think is very smart and a good leader, remains, as he now says he will, as Speaker of the House, and that they, both of them, have the experience and the vision to realize that compromise is the only hope and they can work out some of it. My optimism is rooted mostly in my own experience. The Clinton-Gingrich years, when I was in the White House and the Republicans were controlling the Congress, at least the House, through most of that period, also the Senate through part of it. We actually worked better in the last 6 years of the Clinton administration in getting things through the Congress than we did in the first year when we had to negotiate with our own folks. It was very hard to get our budget reduction plan past the Democrats. I worked on the Simpson-Bowles Commission and another one that my friend Pete Domenici and I headed. And both were very positive experiences, and both had Republicans and Democrats, and in the case of Simpson Bowles, sitting members of Congress who, on the days that we met, when they were not out campaigning and it wasn't an election year, sat behind closed doors and had civil and constructive conversations, and we came up with a pretty good plan. The other reason for optimism is considerable experience with public engagement. I've worked with organizations that went out across the country and gathered pretty good samples of average folks and sat them down around a table with difficult political problems. And you know what? They come up with answers. Average people do this better than the politicians do. They know that a compromise is the thing. If the order is find a solution to this problem, then you're going to have to talk about who thinks this and who thinks that and get it done. And there are organizations in Washington with very good, dedicated people, Convergence, No Labels, the Bipartisan Policy Center, the Concord Coalition, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, all working to try to keep bipartisanship alive. But it won't happen unless citizens speak out and make clear that they value pragmatic solutions over problems, over intransigence in the name of either conservative or progressive principles. And the current election is not showing the public doing that. John Kasich, who is the centrist and the most sensible, and I like John a lot, worked with him in the Congress, is not getting very far with his message of I can work across the aisle. And Hillary is ahead, but Bernie Sanders, in your faceness, is very much there. I think there can be a major role for universities, and especially for public policy programs. First is making sure that people understand that the Constitution requires compromise. We seem to know exactly what the Founding Fathers meant when they wrote that phrase about a well-ordered militia. They were clearly thinking that meant that everybody could carry guns. And we seem to know that they really thought that large political contributions by corporations were a form of free speech, but we don't seem to emphasize what is manifestly true, that we can't get anything done under the system they created without compromise and consensus, and that is very clear in the history. So universities, I think, need to help students understand the difference between dialogue and debate. Debate, you want to win. Dialogue, you're trying to figure common ground, and that is essential to any kind of problem solving. And I think students and faculty need to practice getting across ideological lines. And it doesn't really matter what the issue is. If people were thinking part of the experience of being at a university is to practice continuously in my own life, understanding what the other person's point of view is, where we have some common ground, and how we can solve this problem, we would make a great deal of headway. Now, that may sound hard, but without a big effort to get our political system working to solve problems, we miss the opportunity to enjoy a potentially great economy with sustainable, inclusive, rising prosperity. So if you care about economic policy, and everybody in this room does, and the importance of policy research, then I think we have to figure this out. And I hope you'll do it. Thank you.
Okay, so we have time for a few questions for Alice, so I'll help out to identify the questions. So right here.
Alice, do you think that racism lies behind as an important factor of the political gridlock? Do you think that racism lies behind it as an important factor?
Do you think racism?
I think racism is not dead. And what I'm more conscious of now than racism is the prejudice against people not like us, which includes a lot of things. It's, I think we've made a lot of progress actually on the gay, lesbian, and bisexual community being accepted, but not enough. And that's part of it, and racism is part of it. But the anger that Trump and Cruz are tapping into is against otherness. And it's very powerful, and it's very scary, I think.
More questions over here?
Maybe simplifying what you were saying, but you seem to suggest that there was a set of economic issues, and there was economic resiliency of the US in that respect, and then there were a set of political issues, and that was political polarization. Is there a possibility that the economic inequality in the country is causing the political polarization, and so that a lot of the problems on the political side are actually a consequence of the economic system?
Oh, I think that economic inequality certainly is part of the reason for the anger at the outcomes of the political process. It's not new that we have never been a very equal society. I think now, although the 1% is a symbol, what is probably making more people upset is the feeling that they're not getting ahead, and and this is in economics terms, real wages aren't rising across the spectrum, and somebody else. It's easy to think I'm not getting it because somebody else is. But yes, I think inequality is a big part of it. We've got to, but my point is there are policies that we can put in place that I think would both grow the pie and share it better. And I think there's some fairly obvious ones, and we're not doing it. We're not doing anything.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a question. I don't know if our mics are going to mess up, but so you talked a lot about reforming the tax code and reforming entitlement programs as two things that would help get the country economically to be doing better. And if you look back 30 plus years ago when Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill collaborated on reforms to Social Security, they had a commission. And do you think that would be the most natural way to achieve sort of significant reforms that enhance economic growth and so forth along the lines you described?
The commission specifically.
Right. The commission, is that the way to go? We tried it recently with Bull Simpson and so forth. So
a commission works when the opposing sides want it to work and want to use it as a way of getting to a solution. I think that's what happened in 1983. Alan Greenspan chaired a group. They had a good staff. They put together a feasible plan. And the president and the speaker blessed it. But everybody wanted it to work. And they went into the situation knowing they wanted it to work. And that didn't happen with Simpson-Bowles. Although we had good communication within the group, and I think it could have worked. I blame President Obama in part for the fact that he didn't pick it up and run with it. We expected him to. I'm not sure that would have worked in the current, that he could have pulled that off. What Bowles and Simpson and I and others on the group thought was going to happen, or hoped was going to happen, was that in the State of the Union, this was 2011, that he would say, I got this report, I appointed this great group, they did wonderful work, I don't agree with all of it, but I'm going to work with the Congress to get it done. He didn't do that. And he said afterward that he thought things were so polarized at that moment that if he had done that, he would have killed it because the Republicans would have said, well, if he's for it, I've got to be against it. And there was some truth in that.
Right. Okay. Additional questions? Any out here? Yeah, right over here.
You spoke about the fact that politicians aren't doing much of anything, and we're in a very stationary status quo where nothing's changing. You don't seem to be concerned about the possibility that if they were to implement reforms to economic policies, that they would be on net negative. That's another possibility, is that people make changes and they're bad. Is that not something you're worried about?
Oh, sure, one has to worry about that from the, and I'm quite worried about it with respect to trade, for example. But I think in terms of the things that I was speaking of, which are mainly budgetary actions aimed at growing the economy faster and in a fairer way, I believe there is a broad consensus on most of those things in the country, and that though the details are hard to hammer out, that you could put together a bipartisan coalition on all of those things and get it passed. It's not realistic, I think, to do the grand bargain. It's too complicated to do any one of these things, let alone wrap it all up into one big omnibus bill and say, pass it up or down. That isn't going to work. But I think almost all of the things, well, I think all of the things that I mentioned, if there were a will to sit down and say, well, let's work on this and see how if we can get agreement, I think the chances of getting agreement are not bad. Now, the counterexample, of course, is the last couple of years of budgets where it was a little worse than nothing happening. They squeezed down discretionary spending below what I think are sensible and sustainable levels, and they're going to have to be reversed in the future. But I don't think that would necessarily happen. I mean, I can imagine a President Clinton and a Speaker Ryan working out pretty good deals on a lot of these things. They wouldn't be exactly the way I said it, but they're all subjects on which there is a lot of common ground.
One more question right over here.
So the Glass-Steagall Act, people think, underwrote the stability of the banking system to a significant degree for 7 decades. Its repeal in the 1990s is thought to be one of the things that contributed to the volatility of the system and the crisis of 2008 and 9. Do you think its restoration is any kind of a realistic remedy going forward for the whatever ills there are in the banking system today?
No, I do not. And I don't think the premise of your question that it underwrote the stability is actually right. What we had in that period, in the Glass-Steagall period, was pretty well-regulated commercial banks. So we've known how to do that for a long time, and a growing system, financial system outside investment banks, broker-dealers, and so forth, that were essentially not regulated. And that was the damage. I mean, Glass-Steagall would not have affected Bear or Lehman or the other investment banks that were in deep trouble if we hadn't gotten control of things and brokered these mergers. We'd have lost a series of financial institutions. It would have been a lot worse. And none of that was affected by Glass-Steagall. The mistake that they made, I think, in 98, I guess it was, in repealing Glass-Steagall in favor of Gramm-Leach-Bliley, is that we didn't put in place a strong regulatory system for the shadow banking system. And the amount of leverage and the irresponsibility that was going on in Bear and Lehman and the others should have been under control, and it wasn't. And that didn't have anything to do with Glass-Steagall. It had to do with not understanding that that part of the financial system could get out of control. At least we understand that now, I think.
We've got one more question right over here.
First, I wanted to thank you very much, Alice, for that sobering and yet somewhat optimistic talk, and to pursue the latter theme a moment by asking whether, in talking about the need for vocal support for reform, you think that Americans, women, could form an effective popular front to demand a set of related reforms which would have an impact on the economy as well as on the condition of women. And I'm thinking of both early childhood education, I'm thinking about maternal leave, closing the equality gap for women's wages, and a series of other related forms which liberal democracies elsewhere have used to, in general, raise the level of living and the workings of society. So the question is, what is women's role, particularly as a political force that you see in advancing the programs of reform, workable reform that you envisioned?
What is women's role? That's a really good question, but I do think that women in general are more apt to try to solve the problem rather than to think of situations in terms of win and lose. I have been quoted as saying a long time ago, but people keep telling it back to me, the best preparation for public life is motherhood. If you have a bunch of squabbling children and he hit me first, no, he hit me first, and you can say, it doesn't matter, now we're going to do this together, you've learned a lot. And I think my basic message about politics is mostly that. And I don't know whether I am delighted to have the possibility of a woman president. I'm delighted that we have so many more women in public life. But I think men got to face up to this one too. And I think of it much more as a citizen responsibility than a gender-specific one.
Okay, well, with that, please join me in thanking Alice Rivlin. Yeah, wonderful. Congrats. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.